Alright guys, now we are going to be working on Chapter 12 about fonts, text, formatting your text with fonts and sorts of stuff like that. So we really need to start understanding some of the basics of fonts, and I guess we've all kind of worked with fonts before, even if it's just with Microsoft Word, pulling down something from a drop down that says, okay, do you want to use a like Arial or Times New Roman, something like that, right? There's a lot of options that are on most people's computers. Um, the problem is consistency between them. Okay, we'll find that out in a little bit. Well, let's take a look at different typefaces. Sorry, gonna keep the computer still here. The first type of typeface is probably the typeface that's been around the longest, and that is a serif font. So let me show you what I mean by a serif. And my apologies if you've seen this before in other classes, maybe an art class or something. Serifs are these little bitty things that stick out on the side, like the little knobs that pop out right there, okay? Now let's compare that to another font that's a sans serif, and here's the exact same thing. You notice, so like this would be like a Times New Roman type of font, right? This would be like an Arial or a Helvetica font. This is a much more modern font, 20th century type of font. And these were popular starting probably, I'd say, maybe in the 1900s, the 1920s, and going throughout the 20th century, got more popular. Even into the 1980s, you started seeing this a lot more in a lot of design. And all they do is they just chop off the serifs, the little things that stick out, and they're just slabs. They're just slabs of typeface, okay? And then you've got other kind of fonts which are, um, well, kind of related to serif, or not sans serif. Whether or not they're serifs or sans serif is really irrelevant. This type of font is something called a monospace font, and the reason for that is it's exactly the same spacing between each letter. So this M takes up exactly as much space as this I does, which is clearly not the case in either of these two examples over here. The I is way skinnier than the M. The M is probably one of the widest letters you can get. But monospace is like that, and that's very popular in computer fonts being used, say, from old terminals, like you remember the green screen sort of situations where you would have maybe 40 or 80 characters that you could go in a row in a line of text on a monitor, and they were all the same exact size, so you could come up with some cool like ASCII art. You know, everything took the same space, so you'd know if it was 2 in and 4 down or something like that. Anyway, these are different kinds of fonts that you might run into on a computer system. So they're going to go over some terminology of typeface. Honestly, I have not really needed to know any of this stuff for web design, so we'll just go over it real quick. The bottom line of a font is that, and then you're going to have stuff that kind of dips down. I guess this sort of stuff is important as far as when you're talking about line height of your text. That's as high as the capitals are. That's as high as the ascenders are. Like the tippy top of this H, can go up higher. And then the X height is just your standard like lowercase font. So most typefaces have stuff like that. And that does come into play, I guess, when we're talking about height of things. Now, with typeface, you've also got the thickness of the typeface. So whether or not it's super skinny or super, super fat. Regular fonts look like this, maybe regular typeface weight. Get a little bit bold. Get super bold, they call it black sometimes. Super light, they call it like that, light. And then you've got styles, normal, italic, or oblique is like, I guess, super italic, right? Super leaning. Okay, and then whether or not something has been stretched or condensed. I run into these a lot when I'm looking at font libraries and want to find something that's a little bit tighter or looser. That's what they'll call things. So you'll see things like Gotham condensed oblique or Gotham black normal, condensed or something like that. You'll run into different types of typefaces with that name. Now, the thing is, you don't have a lot of options out there when you're looking at things that are absolutely most of the time on 100% of the computers out there. Um, you're going to have some basic serifs and some basic sans serifs with which to work. Most of these things get installed with Windows or Mac OS or Microsoft Word or something like that. And you'll see when we get to this definition in a second, a lot of times you kind of have to list several in a row in order of preference. If they don't have Georgia, go ahead and use Times New Roman, for example. So they're going to have those serifs, those sans serifs. Your go-to with monospace, by the way, and monospace might be useful in a web sense if you're, like, let's say, wanting to put an address somewhere or lay out some data or computer code. Absolutely looks the best in monospace. If you're literally wanting to put out some computer code on a screen, that's the way to go, right? Monospace. Oh boy, our good friend Comic Sans is still out there. Please don't use that on a website. So you can have fonts that look like someone hand wrote it. You can have fonts that look like somebody, look like maybe a sign printed, sort of a high boldness sort of design, but use those sparingly, okay? Anyway, when you set up fonts on the web, what you're going to probably do is set up a series of fonts in order of preference. So what we're saying here is I want the body of this website to use the Georgia font family, but if they don't have Georgia installed, just go ahead and use Times. If they don't have Times installed, just use any serif font or whatever your default serif font is for your browser. Just go ahead and use that. So this is kind of listed in order of preference, right? And then you can say, well, for the body we want to use that, but for the H1s and H2s we actually want to use sans serif, and that's common to use sans serif as your title, body to use serif. And the reason for that is, by the way, serif text reads better. If you ever go get a copy of the New York Times or even USA Today and you read like a line of text, hundreds of words, it's almost just always going to be written in serif. It's easier for the eye to see at small type whether something is an I or an L and so on if it's got those little serif, little hints hanging off the left and the right. By the way, you notice even on the slide book here, these guys are using a monospace font for their code, and they're using a sans serif font for up here. So take that with what you will, but sans serif is great for titles, stuff like that, so stuff like they're doing here with their H1s and 2s. And for the credits, they might want to put this in Courier New monospace. So they'll say Courier New. And the reason they're putting this stuff in quotes, by the way, guys, is because it's a font that is 2 words. So you can put that in quotes so it doesn't get the computer confused. So use Courier New. If you don't have that, just use any kind of Courier you have. If you don't have that, just use a monospace font. And when you do that, it's going to, come on, guys, look like this. So sans serif top. Monospace there, serif for your body text. Now, not only can we describe the font family that we want, we can also describe how big we want it to be. Now, traditionally, the way this has always been done is just to specify a font size. So you would say 12 pixels, and it would be the size of a pixel on your screen. Now, where that gets to be a problem these days is with mobile phones. And this, since this book was written, this has gotten to be more and more the case, right? So if you said something is 12 pixels, well, great. What if I've got a Retina smartphone or a Retina MacBook, for that matter? And instead of, most monitors traditionally had a resolution of 72 dots per inch. Well, Retina displays have twice that or more, 160 dots per inch. So you end up with really tiny text if you're literally specifying with fonts. Now, a lot of times browsers will scale that for you and try to adapt. But if you want to instead just work in terms that are relative instead of absolute, so instead of literally saying how many pixels high to make a font, you can say percentage or in ems, and I'll explain what these are in just a bit, or actually right now. The relativeness of this font size is Most of the time for a browser, your default font size is going to be 16 pixels. So if I say that this H1 is 200%, that's going to make it 200% of the default font size. Now in this case, our font size is 12 pixels for the body. And so because the H1 is going to be 200% of the body font size, like so, okay, put it this way. If I didn't have this line here, this H1 would be 12 pixels. But because I'm saying, well, I want you to make it 200% of whatever it is, then the font size is going to be 24 pixels in height. And down here for the credits, font size is in yet another format. This is in M's. And so if you think of this as a relative value based on the font size of that box. So if that box is going to be 12, then this is going to be, you take 12 and you multiply it times 1.3. And so what's that? That's probably 16 pixels is what that roughly works out to. So we're going to go through each of these, of course. And you'll end up with something that looks kind of like this, where this is twice as big as that, and that's literally twice as tall. This B is twice as tall, you know, as this B down here. Okay. Now, this is the type scale that what these things are showing up as is points, and a point is roughly equal to a pixel on most monitors. Don't take that for granted though with Retina, but that's about what normally you would see as a type scale. Points are mostly used in text layout, not in CSS layout. Okay, let's talk about font faces, how to choose a font face. So you can use the @fontface directive and say, I want to define a font face and name it chunk5 regular. And so what you're doing is, instead of all that stuff we just saw previously, by the way, guys, it was relying on that font being on that person's computer. Now, I've done this before on some designs that I have where I'm like, no, I really, really want this exact font to be defined. So I use the @fontface directive here in CSS, and then I say, okay, this is a font family that I'm going to name chunk5 regular. And then inside here, I'm going to say its source is this particular file on my hard drive. Go look in the fonts folder and look for this font. Now, we don't really use these fonts anymore, but this is an old book. The principle is the same. Here's the file. And then when I'm in my CSS, I can say font family chunk5 regular, and then I've got a couple of other fallbacks as well. So I'm actually saying to use this exact file. So what has to happen is the website has to download that file to your browser, and when that comes down, ooh, cool, I actually get that exact font, and it looks super like custom magazine looking right now, you know. Right, so I can do all sorts of stuff in here. Oh, good lord. Yeah, just skip this, because this is, well, you don't have to skip it, but some of the stuff, like this IE fix, we don't have to do that anymore. But this is showing how I can say, here are a bunch of different types of the same font that you can all use them. If you want to use an SVG font, a TrueType font, a WAF font. By the way, the WAF font is probably the one that is mostly used these days. I can give you all different kinds of ways to get to it. So if your browser doesn't understand one type, your browser could understand the other types. That's the reason why they're giving you all these. Most of the time we don't have to do that though. So, okay. They're talking to you about formats, and there are other kind of servers and things like that. Something that's kind of come out since this book has come out is Google actually has a web font service where you can use fonts online. Linotype, other places use the same thing, where You basically don't own the font, but you can license the font for web use and get it from their server. I'm not really going to get into that. Uh, oh, yeah, okay, they actually say it right here, hosted fonts, Google Web Fonts. Um, this stuff here, Surfer and Sufon, I don't think that happens anymore. I've not seen any mention of that online. Okay, now I'll show you, by the way. Let me get over to my browser. I was just looking this up here. Uh, so CSS3 fonts here from W3 Schools. By the way, fantastic website, W3 Schools. Show you all kind of cool stuff. They go through all the different types of formats. TrueType font has been around forever. It's a very popular format for Mac and OS. OpenType fonts is kind of like an open one, but by far the most popular web font online is WAF, I would say. And it's basically like an open type font, but it's also got compression built in and additional metadata that gives you like information about the font. The great thing about that is it squishes the font down before it sends it, so it's really efficient. So anyway, you got a nice little chart down here that says just every browser since a long time ago. I mean, Chrome since the 5th. Chrome's in like version 65 now, so it's pretty safe to say that Internet Explorer since 9 has supported all these things. The reason he was using EOT files was because Internet Explorer used that a long time ago, but we don't really support super old Internet Explorer anymore. So that's a good little reference to look at there. Now, the book does have several pages on different kinds of font styling, and just know that I'm not going to quiz you on every in and out of this. It's just good to familiarize yourself with the kinds of things you can do in CSS. Now, obviously, if you're using a font that is already a bold font, like you've literally loaded that font from a hard drive, an exact file from your web server, then you may not need to set it to be bold exactly. But what happens is if you have a standard font like Arial off of somebody's web machine, and you want to say, yeah, let's go ahead and make that a bold font. So you can say font weight bold. You can actually have different degrees of bold. You can have 100, 200, 300, and so on. I think bold might be 400. But if you just said font weight bold, that's going to make the thing, bold right here. Okay. If you said font style italic, the credits are now going to be italic instead of being bold. Now notice, by the way, font weight and font style aren't the same thing. So you can have font weight determines how thick the font is, and font style determines whether it was regular or italic and stuff. There's a difference because you can have something be bold and italic, and so then you'd have to change your font weight to be bold and your font style to be italic. So there's two different things. And there are so many of other these things, and these get a little bit less important, but basically you can say that something needs to be, you can have, even though the text characters you typed in aren't uppercase, you can have CSS auto uppercase or lowercase or capitalize, stuff like that if you want to. You can, if you want to underline something, you have to use text decoration, and that underlines it right there, you see. You can change something called the leading, which that term is it's kind of old school. What it deals with is the literally the height of the lead type piece that was used on the printing press. And so if this says my line height is 1.4 m, that's just saying how high is the box, like how tall is the box of text that's used up here. You can also accomplish the same thing by just adding padding, which we haven't gotten to yet. You can set spacing, all sorts of stuff like this. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on that. This is actually interesting. You can say whether to left, right, or justify. So you can right justify this text, which is kind of cool. Right align it. You can also do vertical alignment. So if I've got a dog here, I can say align it to the top, the bottom, or to the baseline. And the reason for the difference is you see how this Y is like that. So this is actually aligned right there where the text sits on top of the bottom. This is aligned baseline, so that that baseline is there, and that drop down Y sits beneath it. And that's why they showed you that earlier, because there are some subtle differences you get into with some of this. You can indent text for your credits a little bit. Oh, by the way, you see this background images thing. So this is something I don't know if we've talked too much about yet, but in CSS you can actually, instead of making the background of a box a color, you can make the background a picture. So you can do something funky like that if you want to. So this is actually text that we've got in here. And this is a super hack, by the way. I'm not a super big fan of this, but this is a hack. What they're saying is, take this text, make the background a picture, and make sure it doesn't repeat, so the thing doesn't, like, because if you have an image in behind a box, it'll repeat if you don't tell it otherwise, and tile itself. But what they're doing is saying text indent negative 9,999 pixels. So the text is actually like way off the screen, and then it's not visible, obviously. And so then you've got the only thing left there is the picture. Now you say, why didn't he just put a picture? Well, a screen reader can still see that this is actually technically text, and it has the word briards in it. I guess that's the French word. I'm not a fan of that hack, but that's what they're doing there. Oh, and you can do drop shadow. You can do stuff like this in CSS if you want to get into it. You can do crazy, like, magazine style first letter sizing, stuff like that. You can also, well, no, this is important. You can style a link, so you can say what color it is, and you can also style whether a link is a different color based on if it's been visited before. That's something you see a lot. You can also style it whether it's been hovered. You probably see that. So if you hover over a link, it's going to change a certain color. It's going to not be underlined versus underlined, stuff like that. So this is what happens if you have all these fonts and you have visited something. It might be black, and if you hover over it, it's going to be green with an underline, which is what's happening here. Oh, active means it's actually being clicked on. Active is it's in the act of being clicked on. Visited means it's black, and yeah. So, and it's going to be underlined if you're hovering over it. Probably can get into that a little bit more in our labs, which we'll do next week. You can do the same kind of a thing on other sorts of parts of this, by the way. So if you want to deal with, like, say, an input field, and if that button has been hovered on, or that button is active, being clicked on, or even if it's being, like, typed in, you can style that sort of stuff with those a little bit. So just to review this real quick, you can say make all inputs have this CSS, this color, this border and padding. But if it's being hovered over, if it's a submit, or if it's got the class of submit and it's being hovered on, change the background color. If it's in the act of being clicked, that's its active, make it a chocolate color. I don't really think they want you to learn that stuff at this point, so don't be overwhelmed by that. They're just showing you that all that stuff is something that you can change. So what they're doing with that, by the way, is I'm not sure what they're trying to show you here, honestly. Don't pay attention to that. Don't pay attention to that. That is way, way out there. Gee. All right, here's what you need to know from this chapter. There's properties that let you control the choice of font, size, weight, all those sorts of things. You don't get a lot of choice if you're just dealing with the stuff that you're assuming most people have installed. So that's why you can use other fonts. You need to have the right license to use them, and then you can either rent them from a web server or you can host them on your own site. You can do lots of stuff like the space between the lines of text, individual letters, words. You can adjust all that sort of stuff, and it's best just to stick with the basics and enhance it as you see need to. And you can also do things. That's what those were called, by the way, pseudo classes, with that colon hover, colon active. They change what happens when you're hovering over the text or clicking on it. Okay, well, that was a tough one, but we got through it, so I'm I'm glad you stuck with me for it.